Hi everyone, welcome to my little tutorial on how to do some gel printing. I'm going to be printing on a bunch of scrap pieces of paper that I can eventually put inside my junk journal, and I'm also going to be printing directly into my journal itself. So the first thing that I'm going to do is just test out my acrylics, and I'm testing them here for color. I just use any old heavy body acrylics. Whatever's on sale is actually usually what I use. Um, and I'm testing it here on a scratch piece of paper, which then can later work its way into my journal. So I think having lots of scrap paper around is really helpful, and it's a way of giving yourself more stuff to put into your journal, more stuff to be creative with. And you can see I have a really messy desk. I like it that way just so I can add to my journal really easily. So on top of your paint, you're also going to need some rollers, at least one. I have a plastic one and a metal one. I kind of like to have two so that the colors don't get as mixed up, but that's not necessary. And I'm just trying to match the colors here with what's in my journal. Then of course, you also need your gel plate. This is my gel plate I just bought at the craft store. I like to keep it really messy to kind of add character and depth to my prints. Some people like to keep theirs super clean. That's totally up to you. So even though I'm printing directly into my junk journal, I want to put some of the negatives on other pieces of paper. Here I'm using this white piece of watercolor paper. I picked watercolor paper because it's kind of sturdy, and I'm going to be putting these other types of paper on here. Like here's an index card and a little hexagon that I've cut out, and I'm just going to use washi tape to stick these onto that piece of watercolor paper, and then I'm going to print onto that, and then when I remove it, there'll be white space or gray space underneath. I'm also going to get even more paper for this project. I'm using pages out of an old do-it-yourself manual. I really like how thin this paper is. It kind of catches a lot of the paint. It's sort of just like printer paper. But I also like how long the pages are, so then I can use them several times. And then I like that I don't really care that much about the background. It just adds a layer of depth, and it's kind of fun. And for this project, I am going to be printing just a bunch of ferns that were out in my yard. I live in Florida, and there's just a million ferns there. I really like to try and get some with the roots there. That one was a little thick, so I decided to cut off some of it. Also, I have to shake some of the dirt off of there. But yeah, I wanted to print the fern with the roots on there. You can see that I got dirt on my gel mat. That's okay, you can just flip it over and use the other side. It's almost like they're like self-cleaning. And I like to do some planning, so you can see me sort of plan out where I want the ferns here, but it's also just fun to go for it and see what comes out. And for this first layer, I'm going to use this yellowish color. I want to put lots of layers on here. If you watch any gel printing slash junk journal videos, you know it's like all about layers, layers, layers. So this is just the first layer. And I'm trying to get a nice even coat of the acrylic paint on there. I added a little more. You sort of just have to figure out what the best consistency is for you and just go with it. And sometimes it's not enough, and sometimes it's too much. So then I'm going to put on the ferns. You don't have too much space to arrange them, so put them where you want them. And then I'm going to put some of my scratch paper or scrap paper from that DIY manual on there. And I'm going to put a couple other pieces of paper on the corners where it didn't cover it. And then there'll be a little layer right there on those other scrap pieces of paper too. So after you've pressed down and got as much paint onto the paper as possible, you can lift it up, and you'll see that it makes this negative print, and some of the words and images from the manual are on there, and then it's done a really good job of pulling off the paint. So now I'm just going to take off these ferns, and it's going to leave the image that I actually want to print on the gel plate. Also, I'm putting these ferns paint side down, and I'm going to hopefully make some prints out of those. You just squish down on them, and then you've got a fern print. And then I'm just going to take my journal, open it up as flat as I can, and push it down on there. And then I'm going to put some scrap paper on top to catch those edges there that didn't quite make it onto my journal. I'm going to lift the journal itself up a little bit and put it underneath that page so I can get the scrap paper as close to the plate as possible instead of on top of my journal there. And I'll just do that on both sides and squish it all down. So you'll see that I kind of hesitated to put these papers on there a little bit, and that means that the ink that was on the plate is already dry and it's not going to print this time. But that's okay because when you put more paint on top, that layer will actually come up. So when I peel that off, there's a very faint print of a fern there, and then when I peeled this part off, there's really not any at all. Even though those didn't print, I put the journal on pretty fast. So I'm pretty confident that it is going to print. And it did, in fact, come out really a lot like how I wanted it to. So that's great. That doesn't always happen. I think gel printing is full of lots of surprises. So now my goal is just to get that yellow dried up layer off, and so I'm just going to put wet paint right on top of there, and that's going to sort of like reactivate the yellow. And if I just put a piece of paper on there right now, it would actually be this blue and yellow print. But I'm going to put my fern on there and then press my paper down so all these layers sort of come out all at the same time. So when I peel that off, it's going to leave a little blue strip there, and then this is my main print here. So I'm going to make sure I've squished it down as hard as I can, really like where the fern is. I want to get all the detail there, so I try and push it down and press it just as kind of as hard as I can. I don't want to move the paper though. And then when I peel it up, you can see that the yellow and the blue have both transferred onto that piece of watercolor paper and made sort of its own print there. And then I'll pull up the index card and try to be careful not to move the fern too much. I take the fern off, take all of that off, and then that's the print that I want to print onto something else. And I could have just printed that into my junk journal as well, but I decided that I wanted it to be on this picture of Charles Darwin that I was just using as scrap paper before. I decided I wanted to make maybe something better out of that. And then I'm putting more of the DIY manual pages on there just to pull up all of the paint that's on the plate so I can sort of get just like as fresh a start as possible. And this is why you don't really need to clean your mat that much. You can just use paper, and then you're building up layers on these different kinds of papers with these interesting patterns and leftovers from your other prints. So I just smooth all that down and lift it up. You can see there's just a little bit of teal on that one. That's okay, I'll add more to it later. And the same thing on this one, although it did pull up a little bit of the yellow too, so I thought that was cool. And I'm really happy with how this Charles Darwin picture came out, and my index card I think looks great. I'm gonna do some other stuff with that later, so I'm pretty happy with all of that. Now I'm going to make the final print that's going to go in my junk journal. So I'm just doing the exact same process here. I'm putting on this layer of heavy body acrylics, and I'm putting that fern on there. I'm using this paper to catch the paint and remove it and make the negative. You can see this time, maybe because I'm using different paint or because of the humidity in the room, the paint doesn't come off as easily. So I just keep on putting new pieces of paper on there until I get the print. And then I put my notebook on there and I'm just pressing it down really hard. I want it to come out good. I sneak under there and squish the pages down. And then when I pull it up, there is that print that I think just looks great. There is some stray paint on there on the right side. I think it just looks good. And I'm super happy with how this came out. And like I said, I'm not always, it's kind of a risk when you're putting it right into there, into your junk journal. You're not sure if it's going to look good or not. But for me, I think it looks great, and I'm happy to do some more layers and journaling on top. Thanks for watching, everyone. While I have this gel plate out, I'm going to go make a bunch more prints on different pieces of paper, but I just wanted to show you this spread layer here in my junk journal. If you enjoyed this video, there's lots more on my Patreon. The link is below. You can subscribe there and follow along as I do all kinds of crazy stuff in my junk journal and write some poems. Thanks a lot.